Hey, Farmers Branch family. Time again for Bible study from the Big Comfy Chair. We continue with our whirlwind tour through the Gospel of John. Now, it's kind of occurred to me that we needed to talk about, in this part of John, we need to talk about 5G. 5G. You all know what 5G is, right? No, not that 5G. No, there's another 5G. Because in this week, Jesus goes through 4Gs on his way to a big G. And the big G is to his glorification, to his glory. But he goes through some pretty disturbing G's on the way, which we will stop and discuss as we get to them. And this is actually a literary device, 3 of G's, and I added a fourth one, and you'll figure out why when I get there. Mainly so I could be real pithy and talk about 5G. It didn't work. No, it didn't work on Sonia either. But we'll discuss the G's as we go, but the 3 of the G's are actually John's literary device, where he employs these 3 Hebrew/Aramaic dialect, Hebraic Aramaic dialect words that describe vividly the circumstances that Jesus is going to go through during this time of his crucifixion. So we're going to back up. We covered a bit of it already, and at that time it had not occurred to me that John had used a literary device, an alliteration, in his telling of this story. So if we go back to the ~17th chapter. Well, to the first of the 18th chapter. I'm sorry for the long pause. Gotta get my brain in gear. At the beginning of the 18th chapter, it says, when he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side, there was a garden, and his disciples went into it. And we find that this garden is Gethsemane. That's the first G between Galilee and Gethsemane. And Gethsemane is a word that means an olive press. It's a place where olives are crushed and their oil rendered. Thank you, Sonia. Important stuff first. More important stuff now. And it's the place, as when we read the account of Jesus' agony, it's the place where his will is crushed and the oil of his Spirit poured out, where his will is crushed and the will of the Father is made prominent. And we'll go to the other G's as we get there. But I just wanted to warn you that there were going to be some G's, just study of the G's, or in this case, gammas or gimmels, depending on which language we're talking about. G in English, gamma in Greek, gimel in Hebrew or Aramaic. Okay, I don't need to give up my day job, do I? Go on the road as a comedian. It's not gonna Oh well. So we left off where Jesus is been arrested, and they have taken him to the high priests. Now, I think we'll go ahead and go all the way from Gethsemane to Golgotha and then on to Gehenna. And let's just go ahead and do that in one fell swoop here. So Jesus has gone through, and we got to the place where Peter has cut off the high priest's servant's ear. He had cut off Malchus's ear. And so Jesus, he asked them, "Who is it you want?" This is in the 4th verse. So Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said, and Judas the traitor was standing there with them. And when Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said. Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. If you're looking for me, then let these men go." And this happened, these are the words of John. "This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. I have not lost one of those you gave me." And you remember from his prayer. Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Well, what you want to bet Peter wasn't aiming for his ear? Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" And this is probably confusing Peter pretty badly, because this is the sword that in another place it's recorded that headed to the Garden of Gethsemane, the place of the olive press. He asked him, he says, "Has anybody got a sword?" They said, "Well, we've got 2. He said, "That's enough." So he was making sure that they had swords, but didn't intend for them to use them. You know, it reminds me of the Sermon on the Mount, or actually the Olivet Discourse. Not Sermon on the Mount, I'm sorry. Sermon on the Mount. Where he says, "The meek shall inherit the earth." The connotation of that is idiomatic. It is some Greek idiomatic language. And it implies one who has a sword and is skilled in using it, that when confronted, leaves it in its sheath. Meek here is not mousy or dominated. Meek here is someone who has lethal force at their disposal, but chooses not to use it. Apparently, Peter had forgotten that lesson. "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good if one man died for the people. And of course, he was also the object of Jesus' polemic with Lazarus at the rich man's gate. So Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. John speaking of himself, of course. But Peter had to wait outside the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. "You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you?" she asked Peter. He replied, "I am not." It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter was also standing with them, warming himself. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus says, "I have spoken openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues or at the temple where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said." When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him in the face. "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" he demanded. "If I said something wrong," Jesus replied, "testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there warming himself. So they asked him, "Aren't you one of his disciples too?" He denied it, saying, "I am not." And one of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment, a rooster began to crow. Famous prophetic denials of Peter. Many sermons, much good commentary on that subject, so I won't expand that too much tonight. Then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they didn't enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. Now, lest the irony of that be lost, they were worried about their ceremonial cleanness. They were worried about being defiled by entering the house of a Gentile. There was no scriptural requirement that would render one unclean for that activity. This was another one of those rules that the Pharisees had conjured up to add to the burden of keeping the law of Moses. They were worried about this non-required requirement and weren't at all worried that they were trying and condemning an innocent man. And as I recall, bearing false witness is one of the big 10. The irony shouldn't be lost on us here. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "Well, if he were not a criminal," they replied, we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," they objected. Now, we do know that they had the authority to execute people. Execution by stoning was not uncommon, and we see that they certainly dispatched with poor Stephen by that means a while later, right? Well, that's not really what they're saying here. They're not saying we don't have the authority to execute a man. What they're saying is, we have no right to kill him the way we want to kill him, the way the prophets said he would be killed. In order to fulfill the prophets and in the prophecies of Jesus' own words, he must be lifted up. The serpent in the wilderness was on a pole. In Zechariah 12, which we'll get to some interesting things like that when John references that passage of Scripture, they look upon the one whom they have pierced, signifying what kind of death Jesus would die. So when they say this, we have no right to execute anyone, was their objection. What they mean is, we don't have the right to execute someone the way he needs to be executed. And this took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. Remember when he's speaking to Nicodemus, he said, the Son of Man, as Moses lifted the serpent in the wilderness, so shall the Son of Man be lifted up. A double meaning in Greek, both physically hoisted up upon a stauron, the instrument of crucifixion, but also to be exalted in the same action. Crucifixion wasn't meant to be exalting, but the language that Jesus used meant both. Exalted while being crucified. We can talk about crucifixion here a bit. It was an especially cruel means of punishment. It was one that in the biblical record, I believe, was first employed by the Assyrians, who would impale people on a pole raised around the cities that were under siege. The Jews themselves had employed crucifixion in their history fairly recent to this, when a high priest, a Sadducee high priest, had a couple hundred of his Pharisee political opponents crucified in Jerusalem. Yeah, Jews had done that themselves by nothing less than a high priest, but they apparently didn't have permission from the Roman governor at this time. So it was a particularly cruel thing. The worst curse that a slave in the Roman Empire could heap upon another slave was crux mala egite. Go to the bad cross. Go to the bad cross. It's the worst curse. It is written, cursed is he who hangs upon a tree. Jesus took the curse of sin upon himself and became accursed for our sakes. So what they're saying here is not that they don't have the right to kill a man. They just don't, at that time in history, they needed the permission of the Romans, because the Romans reserved that for their enemies, never for their citizens, but for their enemies, and they reserved the right to employ that torturous death. So Pilate went back inside the palace. He summoned Jesus and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Now here again, like we see all through the Gospel of John, Jesus goes straight to the matter, because at this point, he had not received charges. And we see that his wife a little bit later, his wife has suffered much in the way of a dream, recorded in another gospel. So Jesus had no doubt been the point of discussion between Pilate and his wife, maybe Pilate and others. So Jesus, in response to, "Are you the king of the Jews?" says, "Is that your own idea? Or did others talk to you about me?" Well, Pilate is startled. He says, "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied, "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me, so what is it you've done?" He deflects. Evidently, Jesus hit a real nerve there, because deflection is the reaction of someone who has been struck where it hurts. Jesus said, "No, we're not getting away from this king thing so quickly, Pilate." That's my interjection, of course, because the gospel records that Jesus said, in response to, "What is it you have done?" he responds not to the question he's asked, as we see over and over again in the Gospel of John. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." I am, in fact, a king. My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But my kingdom is from another place. Not another place on this world, someplace other than this world. "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, You say that I'm a king." Pilate, I heard it in your private moments. I heard you and your wife discuss it. You're the one said I'm a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into this world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. One of the more echoed and preached on and tragic lines in the gospel. He had truth standing right before him and feels the need to deflect again with sophomoric philosophy. With this, he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him." He just said he was a king. Pilate agrees he's a king, apparently, and finds no basis for a charge against him. "But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of Passover. Do you want me to release the King of the Jews?" Now, I don't think he's being dismissive here. I don't think that this is sarcasm. I don't think this is a sarcastic remark. I think he's a little perplexed. He says, "I think he's the King of the Jews, spiritual king." He makes the claim for himself and is confirmed what I was thinking, and they don't see it. "I can release you a prisoner." He's given them an out. "I can release you a prisoner. You want me to release the King of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now, Barabbas had taken part in an uprising. This is interesting. There's one set of New Testament manuscripts that refers to Barabbas as Jesus Barabbas. There may be there's at least one other ancient source that seems to indicate that Barabbas was not his given name, that his name was Jesus. Barabbas means his father's son, or son of a father. It was sort of a colloquial for daddy's boy. But here they had the choice between two Jesuses, the son of the Father. One whose father was earthly, and apparently he didn't raise his boy well, and the other was the God of the universe. Two Jesus Barabbases. Not that one. We want the other one. A little bit of poetic irony there. So in the 19th chapter, then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they slapped him in the face. Now, I do believe this was sarcasm. And let's examine a couple of interesting things about this situation. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. Jesus was being revealed as the sacrifice for sin. The purpose that he told his disciples he had come into the world for. And so he's going to play this out from among the thorns. Yeah, the burning bush was where Jesus revealed himself to Moses. And some little nuance of the Hebrew text, it turns out that that burning bush was a thorn bush that appeared to be on fire. So there, Jesus, in revealing himself to Moses for the first time as the I am that I am, spoke from among the thorns. And here, he identified himself from among the thorns, and now he signifies his true purpose and plan and destiny, again from among the thorns. And they clothed him in a purple robe. Now, purple robes were hard to come by. Not this kind of purple robe, but purple robes for royalty. Purple robes signified Hellenistic princes or Greek princes. You remember back in the study of the Lazarus at the Rich Man's Gate, we talked about the nature of wearing purple robes, and that there was only one Hebrew in Jerusalem that would be allowed to wear a purple robe, and that permission was granted by Greek princes in the time after the Maccabean revolt, and that would be the high priest. And that is, after all, the color of the tabernacle and the veil of the temple, and it is the color of the high priest's robe in Old Testament. This color purple is sort of a shabby approximation of what would be considered a royal robe. The Romans wore scarlet robes. High-ranking officers and their prefects, Pontius Pilate, was probably wearing a scarlet or deep crimson red robe. Now, the particular dye that was used to make a Roman soldier's scarlet cape was prone to fading in the sun. And when it faded, it made a color that was sort of purplish. And it's certainly within the range of colors that would be described by this word purple. Porphyra in Greek. they put it on him, this faded and discarded piece of uniform from a Roman officer who would not have worn it in that condition, with a crown of thorns, mocking the idea that he was a king. But that crown of thorns, Jesus says, no, I'm the one that speaks from the thorns. I'm no earthly king. He's already pointed that out to Pilate. I'm much, much more. Once more, Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there, look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him. And when Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, here is the man. Look, he's been humiliated. He's been abused. Is not that enough for you? And as soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, crucify, crucify. But Pilate answered, you take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him. The Jewish leaders insisted, we have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God. And when Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid. In keeping with the mental state that we have built for Pilate in this study tonight. And he went back inside the palace. Where do you come from? He asked Jesus, but Jesus gave him no answer. Do you refuse to speak to me? Pilate said, don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you? And Jesus answered, you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. Now, where are you from? Jesus gave no answer until he says, don't you know I can crucify, I have power? And he says, you'd have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Telling Pilate, I am indeed the Son of God. I did not originate on this earth. My power and my kingdom reside in heaven. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free. But the Jewish leaders kept shouting, if you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. So this was the one thing that Pilate was afraid of. He had not been a particularly good bureaucrat. He had done well in the military. In fact, Pontius is his name. Pilate is an accolade, which says someone who is good with a javelin. So he's evidently a good soldier and a worthy warrior. He was a very bad administrator. In fact, he would be removed in disgrace by Caesar after he got a bit too heavy-handed in putting down a Samaritan revolt at Mount Gerizim a few years later. There is an extra chapter of Acts, ostensibly an extra chapter of Acts that's included in some Bibles these days. That was probably written in medieval times. There are no ancient manuscripts that include it. And it doesn't really read like any of the rest of Acts, and it's only found in its, quote, translation. There are no manuscripts, actual ancient Greek manuscripts that contain that body of writing. But in it, we find both the Apostle Paul and Pontius Pilate in Britain during the time of the Roman conquest of Britain. Paul is there for evangelistic reasons. Pilate is sent there because he has fallen out of favor with Caesar and failed as a ruler and administrator in Judea. And Britain was the place that no Roman soldier wanted to go, because my ancestors were there and they paint themselves blue and eat parts of their enemies. We don't do that anymore, I hope. But the Romans were scared, and it was it was the farthest place away from Rome you could get in the Roman Empire. But it has Pontius Pilate killing himself. I just mentioned that because I did want to get some licks in on that extra chapter of Acts, because don't fall for that. It's not real. And when I see that in some translation of the scriptures, it throws up red flags about what might be going on in other parts of the particular translation. So here we're going to get to the next G. We've been to Gethsemane, but now we need to go to the next G. When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the stone pavement, or the lithostrata in Greek. It just means a place. It's capitalized in the Greek, so it's a kind of an official name for it, the place of the stone pavement. But John here points out that in Aramaic or Hebrew, and it's translated both ways. You know, in some translations it says Hebrew, the other Aramaic, and it's a word, Hebraista. I can't remember the Hebrew something in Greek, that is used in the Greek language to refer both to the actual Hebrew language or to the sort of Hebraic form of Aramaic, which is Babylonian or Syriac. So, but in which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. This is an interesting thing. You know, when you start seeing this alliteration, Gethsemane, the place of crushing, Gabbatha, which in its simplest use just means an elevated place, that the throne, the seat of judgment that Pilate occupied was raised on a platform, a high place. But it has some special connotations in Hebrew and Aramaic. It has some special connotations. It is associated with hubris, or unjustified self-exaltation, or haughtiness. Here we get the idea that John is bringing this up, and he's pointing out the arrogance of any earthly power, even a Roman prefect. The arrogance, the hubris, the haughtiness, the presumption of judging the God of Israel and wanting to appear higher and superior. I think that's why John is pointing out its name in Hebrew, because in Greek it's the stone pavement. He said, but they call it something else in Aramaic. They call it Gabbatha. And it was the day of preparation of the Passover, and it was about noon. Here's your king, Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, take him away, crucify him. Shall I crucify your king? Now, this is not sarcasm from Pontius. This is not sarcasm on his part. He is pleading with them, don't do this. Don't do this. You put me in an untenable position here by pulling the Caesar card. Don't do it. We have no king but Caesar. The chief priests answered. That's telling. We submit to Caesar. We have no other king. God is not our king. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. So the soldiers took charge of Jesus, carrying his own cross to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is the next G, Golgotha. Now we've got a lot of interesting things to say about Golgotha and what it represents. But the lesson has gone just a little bit long, and I'd like to really spend some time on the place of the skull. Why is it called place of the skull? Is it because it looks like a skull? We'll find out next week.